This lecture is going to be on Pauline Johnson, a woman for all seasons. Pauline Johnson was born in 1861 and died in 1913. And in the journey of her life, she covered an immense terrain. And in that sense, what the terrain she did cover, or the landscape she walked over in her life, can tell us much about what it means to be a peacemaker, a bridge builder, someone who has tried to avoid the pitfalls of submerging themselves uncritically in one tribe, one clan, or another. Pauline Johnson came from a very well-known First Nations family. Her grandfather, Smoky Johnson, was a part of the whole exodus in the United States after the 1776 movement in the United States in terms of independence from Britain. And the First Nations in the United States, particularly the Iroquois, the Mohawk, they were seen as targets, increasingly so, for a growing American patriotism. And they were, many of them, fled north of the border into Canada. They aligned themselves, inevitably and necessarily so, with the English, for the simple fact the English would protect them against who were seen as the enemies and the threat to the Iroquois Mohawk people. I might add that centuries before this, the Mohawk Iroquois nations in the United States again and again were at one another, warlike. The treatment of different tribes in the United States, it had quite a violent background on the one hand. On the other hand, there had been a variety of people who tried to bring together these different tribes. Hiawatha in the 16th century was known as one of the great peacemakers, and he brought together various peoples within the Iroquois tradition, but he himself suffered immensely. One of his most substantive opponents killed his wife and daughter, and the natural tendency when one's closest to kin are killed is vengeance, it's vindictiveness, it's turn on those who have hurt me. But he, going to greater depths as a peacemaker, his question and commitment was, how do I overcome the temptations toward bitterness, anger, poisons in my soul, and then retributive justice, and then go after the particular person who was seen as his prime enemy because of what he had done to his family. So Hiawatha overcame that temptation to vindictiveness and became a peacemaker. Fast forward the Hiawatha tradition to the tension, certainly in the 18th century, the United States, and then the coming to be of the Iroquois into southern Ontario at the time, mostly coming up from New York. Pauline Johnson's great-grandfather, Smoky Johnson, was a part of that group that came up. Southern Ontario, they were provided land in the Brantford area. And in the 1812 war, it was again the Iroquois, the Mohawk, who fought with the British to keep the Americans out of Canada. Interestingly enough, if it had not been for that, and in the 1812 war Canada lost, we would be but a star in the American flag at the present time. And so this notion that that the First Nations somehow were constantly at odds with Canadian tradition. In fact, it is the very opposite in the founding of Canada, that the Iroquois Mohawk fought very closely with the British to keep the Yankees out of Canada. So here you have another tension in peacemaking. What happens when the other is not interested in peace, but in fact is invading your country, destroying your people? How do you respond? So we're into the issue really of the owl, the dove, and the hawk. If you don't want to be a hawk, but on the other hand, pacifism, the dove does not work. What's the relationship between just war, or under what conditions does one fight? So Pauline Johnson comes from this Johnson family. Her father went on to become, and also they very much sided with the British in the 1837 rebellion under William Lyon Mackenzie. And so this unity between the Mohawk, Iroquois, First Nations, United Empire Loyalists that came up to Canada in the thousands, in the period of time of the American Civil War, was once again the First Nations identified very closely with the British. And Pauline Johnson's father then, moving the next generation from Smoky Johnson to George Johnson, he became the chief of the Six Nations in the Brantford area. And Pauline Johnson grew up within that family, and very much she understood the history of the First Nations, the British. Her mother came from an English background. Her father was very much First Nations. So she had to live within her own soul two different heritages. The British tradition, with its tendencies, at times its imperial colonial elements, which were very real. On the other hand, the British tradition, which was very embracing of the First Nations. So sometimes when we get into settler colonial ways of thinking, history was much more complex at this period of time, in which the First Nations recognized that their future, their safety hinged on working very closely with the English. I might also mention that the Iroquois Confederacy, which brought together, one of the first confederations really in world history, brought together warring tribes within the Iroquois heritage, of which there were six tribes within that. And so within southern Ontario, in the Brantford area, Pauline Johnson's father, were at the forefront of peacemaking between the English and First Nations. Pauline Johnson, as I mentioned, had to live in two worlds, which is never easy. But she was a bridge builder as a result of that. She both had internalized via her mother the best of the English heritage, and even in the marriage between her mother and father, both sides were very suspicious of the marriage. First Nations preferred people to marriage within their heritage, the British obviously within their heritage, and so there was courageous decisions on both Pauline Johnson's mother and father's position in terms of opposition from local families. So we can see a bridge building tendency once again. Here is someone who is, from her history, not only First Nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, but also the British First Nations tradition, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy, building bridges. Yet once again, when the temptation is very much to fragment, to isolate, to polarize, here is a family background of which Pauline Johnson inherited to, in fact, transcend the tribalism of different clans, whether ethnic clans, whether the British tribe, whether First Nations, and say there is a higher truth, there are higher insights in life than being immersed only in the place of one's blood family, but there is a greater family or community of conscience or nations of conscience which does not fit neatly into the Procrustean bed of a very limited understanding of what peacemaking is all about. So Pauline Johnson grows up in the Brantford area. As I mentioned, she very much is, as a young woman, grappling with what it means to be both English and First Nations and living in that tension. Pauline Johnson had a gift, a very unusual and unique gift in poetry, in theater. She knew how to articulate the best insights via poetic means in a theatrical way in terms of the large issues of her time. She was the first woman who really was embraced by our Confederation poets, who were the great poets of the late 19th century, which were envisioning a view of what's the relationship of community and nature and literature and culture. Pauline Johnson was a part of that group, and then her friendship with Seton, one of the earlier Canadian environmentalists. Again, Pauline Johnson was very, very connected to him, and their friendship was very enduring and stayed with her to the end. So she was a leading lady in the 19th century, probably one of the most prominent leading ladies in a literary, a cultural level, transcending the British First Nations categories. And in the 1990s, she went on to become probably the leading woman in Canada, crisscrossing Canada, reading her poetry in a dramatic, animated manner that held audiences spellbound again and again. She was in the United States articulating these issues, and she was never shy for a moment in her poetry, her readings, of clearly enunciating how First Nations had been mistreated, how they had been misread, how they are caricatured. And so it wasn't as if she had subordinated her First Nations heritage for the purpose of accepting into an imperial white culture. She constantly raised hard and difficult questions that could offend right-wing English nationalists. And in her poetry, she would on the one hand come out on a stage dressed as a proper English lady in good form, and the second part of a presentation, she'd come dressed up very much in Iroquois clothes. Obviously a metaphor and a symbol as a bridge builder. Much easier to come dressed out just in Iroquois Mohawk clothes and turn on the English or others who are not First Nations. Her audience would have shrunk if she did so. So she knew how to purchase a voice in the public square through drawing in those within the English tradition who had a sensitive conscience towards the First Nations plight. And then she would articulate that very, very clearly through theater. She was probably one of the earliest women in Canada, if not the earliest, who could bring together poetry, the public stage, and articulate the First Nations English issues and the tensions between them. So throughout most of the 1890s and the first decade into the 20th century, there is probably no other woman who knew how to do that. Pauline Johnson also, so there's also what might be interesting in terms of a woman of all seasons. Her family was not always the easiest, particularly siblings she had her differences with and her clashes with, and her sister never really fully understood her artistic abilities. And so the tensions within the family itself, both temperamentally, giftedness, the way she directed her life, made for tensions, and she constantly, in her imperfect way, tried to bridge those chasms, which were never easy. And there's a variety of articles by her sister on Pauline, many of them appreciative, some of them not going into the depth and detail of the family tensions, but nonetheless, Pauline tried to bridge that. Illness, Pauline Johnson had some serious illnesses, and certainly as an actress on the stage in the 1890s, first decade of the 21st century, she lost all her hair and having to wear wigs. And again, she would overcome illnesses like this. Family frustrations, what could be tensions between the British and First Nations, health concerns that dogged her constantly. Again and again you see in Pauline Johnson someone who faces into the temptation to become cynical, to become skeptical, just to fold her hands and give up because the challenges were too much in her life. But she never ceased to recognize means and ways by which she could be water round rock in some of the most seemingly improbable difficulties and ever move down the stream of life in a meaningful manner. She was one of the most prolific poets during this time, a variety of books coming out in terms of her very lucid insights, again, in the relationship of First Nations, the very sensitive Confederation poets and Seton in terms of what is the relationship to ultimate reality, humanity, community, and nature itself. How do these all come together? And so Pauline Johnson School in Vancouver, some of you may have heard of it. There was also in one of the Canadian stamps the Pauline Johnson stamp. In her latter years, as her body was failing and ailing, she then moved to Vancouver, and out of that period of time she had met Chief Joe Capilano in England in 206. They had struck up a good friendship, and as Pauline Johnson knew that her more creative years of being on the stage and traveling on-stop, crisscrossing Canada into the States, giving poetic readings dramatically, that intense 20 years, there's only so long you can keep up that level of intense speed and haste and busyness and constantly on stage. It wears the soul and body down eventually. By 19, and she was very fond of the West Coast, and she was received very kindly on the West Coast as well. By 1909, Pauline Johnson decided to move to Vancouver. She was shortly after diagnosed with breast cancer, and she had very little money, and this was long before universal health care, and so how was she to pay for medical costs, hospital treatment, all of these basic costs which can drive a person into pauperdom? And it was out of that experience, again, in the midst of suffering and cancer and the inevitable life path toward death, comes Legends of Vancouver. And so her stories that we've been looking at in our Western Peace tradition, Legends of Vancouver, quite a variety are about peacemaking. They're about dealing with conflict, either within or between First Nations, or between at this period of time, obviously, the British ruling class and First Nations. And so the book is replete with really the life story of Pauline Johnson. And in the sales of that book, Legends of Vancouver, she brings together some of the finest stories of First Nations as told by Chief Joe Capilano, and then records them, and that helped pay for the latter part of her years and the medical treatment she was given. But Pauline Johnson is a woman for all seasons, and she has been to some degree dismissed at this period of history in terms of First Nations clashes and ideology, and who speaks for First Nations and whose version of history and who is the spokesperson, without recognizing First Nations have a wide history and interpretations of that history. So she is one not only who transcended these temptations towards polarization, both within, she crosses Canada in terms of the Iroquois Confederacy. She works with the Cree. She understood the various West Coast First Nations. And so she crisscrossed Canada as a bridge between First Nations, and then obviously a bridge between the white Caucasian culture and First Nations. And then the various sufferings she went through in terms of losing her hair, her cancer, family dynamics which were not always the happiest in many ways, people she worked with which were not always the easiest to work with. And so regardless of how the portal one enters into the life of Pauline Johnson, she very much is a woman for all seasons. She was buried in Stanley Park, a favorite area of hers, and anyone who circles Stanley Park, particularly if they have read Legends of Vancouver, the many places she mentions are sort of totems or icons or portals into much larger First Nations stories. And Siwash Walk, which was a very important area of hers, is again one of those portals into her life. And then if one circles around Stanley Park, there's recently been put up a lovely gravestone in honor of Pauline Johnson. So when we think of peacemakers, peacekeepers, Pauline Johnson very, very much embodies at the very highest and most exquisite level a woman in Canada who is at the forefront long before it was trendy to be a peacekeeper, someone who again and again overcame the tribalism of left or right, ethnic or non-ethnic. And in that sense, she models a way, even in our time, of how one does not become sucked into a certain perspective on interpreting reality from within one side or another. She had the nimbleness, the suppleness of heart and soul, both within her flesh and her soul. And I suspect one of the reasons Pauline Johnson has been somewhat ignored at the present time within First Nations studies is she doesn't fit easily into any First Nations categories, and particularly when there are certain forms of First Nations which are more confrontational rather than irenical or peacemaking. And she embodies a peacemaking or irenical vision of First Nations, Caucasian, settler, colonial traditions that does not fit narratives simply. And so when one thinks even of going into First Nations or Aboriginal studies, a turning to Pauline Johnson as a woman for all seasons could be a good entry point into a more irenical way of approaching that does not unnecessarily polarize people and can move things forward in a more healing peace pipe tradition, wampum belt tradition, of which Pauline Johnson, again, in her public performance, has always made it clear why she wore the symbols she did, because the symbols were about peace above all else. And her own history is one in which that was embodied, while recognizing also in the metaphors of dove, owl, hawk, at what point does the owl have to engage with those? They wouldn't have articulated it in this way in a just war tradition, but where there are those who will increasingly and violently destroy other people in Iit relationships, as Martin Buber would talk about. So what happens when people do not want to engage in I-thou relationships? Everything is reduced to an ideological I-it. Where do you stand in the culture wars? If you're not with me, cancel culture dominates. A Pauline Johnson embodies a way of engaging the I-thou, not only within her own soul, but between others and in the bigger Caucasian First Nations civilization. Very important, I might add by way of conclusion, is that Pauline Johnson and the Johnson family always must be read within their historic context. So to dismiss someone who doesn't seem to fit into a Procrustean ideological bed without understanding the historic context within which they're trying to be a bridge builder is an act of just insensitively approaching another people. It can be quite boorish and barbarian, actually, to just isolate someone from their historic context and not understanding the big issues they had to struggle with in their times. So Pauline Johnson, even within the First Nations tradition, as I mentioned earlier, she needs to be recalled, phoenix-like resurrected. In doing so, I think a great contribution can be made to First Nation studies by honoring once again the role Pauline Johnson played within Canadian history and how she can continue to play such a role in Canadian history in the midst of our intense and oft polarized culture wars.